Story 1. Driving a night bus had its perks. The roads were empty, and I could enjoy the quiet. My route took me through the outskirts of town, where after midnight, passengers were rare. I started the engine, checked the instruments, and set off. The streets were lit by sparse streetlights, casting long shadows across the asphalt. After passing several stops without seeing a single soul, I thought the night would be uneventful. At the next stop, I noticed a man standing. This was unusual for this time and place. He stood with his back to me, dressed in a dark coat, the hood pulled low over his face. I brought the bus to a stop and opened the doors. The man slowly climbed the steps without looking up. "Good evening." I tried to start a conversation, but he didn't respond. The passenger walked to the back of the bus and sat in the last row. I shrugged and kept driving. The heavy silence in the bus was palpable. Occasionally, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the man sat motionless, his face obscured in shadow. After a few minutes, I noticed the temperature inside the bus had dropped. My breath became visible with each exhale. I checked the heater. It was working fine. Strange, I thought, but chalked it up to the coolness of the night. At the next stop, there was no one waiting, but suddenly, the passenger had moved closer, now sitting in the middle of the bus. His movements were smooth, almost soundless. "Is everything all right?" I asked, turning to look at him. Again, he didn't respond. The unsettling feeling was growing. Something about his behavior felt off. I decided to ignore it and focused on the road. After some time, I heard a faint rustling. Turning my head, I saw that the man had moved again, now sitting directly behind me. My heart started to race. "Where are you headed?" I tried again. The man slowly raised his head. His eyes were cold and empty. He smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth. "Just along for the ride," he said quietly. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to hide my unease. The feeling of danger inside me was building. I considered stopping the bus and asking him to leave. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered and went out. The bus came to a halt in the middle of the empty road. I tried to start it again, but nothing happened. "Trouble?" I heard the voice behind me. Turning, I saw the man had stood up, staring directly at me. His face was now clearly visible, his skin pale, and his eyes impossibly bright. "Stay where you are," I said, trying to sound confident. He took a step forward. "Tonight's special, isn't it?" he said, with a mysterious tone. My heart pounded in my chest. Deciding not to wait and find out what would happen next, I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The man smiled wider, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth. "Just some company," he replied. At that moment, I noticed movement outside the bus windows. Shadows flickered in the darkness. It felt like we weren't alone. "Who's out there?" I asked, looking out the window. "My friends," the passenger said calmly. From outside came the sound of scraping against metal. The bus rocked slightly, as if something had climbed on top of it. Panic gripped me. I had to act. Jumping up, I tried to open the door, but the mechanism wouldn't respond. The man watched me, emotionless. "It's no use," he said. "They're already here." Just then, a side window shattered, and a hand with long claws reached inside. I stumbled backward, hitting a seat. "What is that?" "Oh my God, what's happening?" I shouted. The man stepped closer. "It's rare we get a chance to chat," he said. "Usually, people run so quickly." I realized this wasn't just some random passenger. The creature standing in front of me was something else. Without wasting any more time, I grabbed the emergency hammer and smashed the nearest window. The glass shattered, falling to the ground outside. "Resistance is pointless," his voice echoed behind me. Ignoring him, I jumped out of the bus and sprinted down the road. Behind me, I heard the sounds of pursuit and inhuman growls. The road was dark, and there was no one around. In the distance, I saw lights. It looked like a gas station or roadside diner. Gathering all my strength, I ran toward them. My breath was ragged. My legs felt weak, but the fear pushed me forward. I burst into the lit building, where a woman stood behind the counter, staring at me in surprise. "Help me! They're after me!" I shouted. She didn't have time to respond before the door slammed open. Two figures stood in the doorway. They looked human, but something about them was off. Their eyes glowed in the dark, their faces distorted. "Who are you? What do you want?" the woman screamed. One of the creatures stepped forward. "We're just looking for our friend," it said, pointing at me. I backed away, grabbing something off the counter to defend myself. The woman, terrified, reached for the phone and began dialing the police. "I'm calling the police right now. You'd better leave," she said, her voice firm but shaking. The creatures exchanged glances and began slowly moving inside. At that moment, a man, likely a security guard, emerged from the back. Seeing the situation, he pulled out a baton. "What's going on here?" he asked. Before he could do anything, one of the creatures lunged at him with incredible speed. The man fell, hitting his head on the floor. The woman screamed. I knew staying there was dangerous. Grabbing the woman by the arm, I pulled her toward the back exit. "Run!" I yelled. We burst out onto the street and ran toward the nearest building. Behind us, I could hear footsteps and the sound of something scraping. We ducked into an alley and hid behind some dumpsters. "What's happening?" she whispered, trembling with fear. "I don't know, but they aren't human," I replied. Trying to move quietly, we made our way along the wall. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed above us. I looked up and saw one of the creatures on the roof. It was searching for us, sniffing the air. "We need to get to the police," I whispered. She nodded, and we continued. The street was deserted, but in the distance we saw the flashing lights of a police car. Gathering our strength, we ran towards it. "Help!" we shouted as we ran into the road. The car screeched to a halt, and 2 officers stepped out. "What happened?" one of them asked. We didn't even have time to answer before the creatures emerged from the darkness. They looked human, but still appeared incredibly strange. Their movements were jerky and awkward, like rag dolls being dragged along. The officers, upon seeing them, hesitated for a moment, but then drew their weapons. "Freeze!" one of them commanded. The creatures didn't stop. In fact, they began moving faster, transforming into something horrifying. Fur started sprouting from their bodies, and their shapes began to shift. Chaos erupted, gunshots rang out, and there were screams. I grabbed the woman and ducked behind the police car. A few minutes later, everything fell silent. The creatures had disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. One of the officers was injured, while the other was calling for backup. We were taken to the station to give our statements. No one could explain what had happened. The surveillance cameras had only captured blurry figures. Our statements were recorded, but it seemed like even the police didn't fully grasp what had happened to us. Days passed. I tried to get back to my normal life, but the fear lingered. Every time I sat behind the wheel of the bus, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see that same passenger. Story 2. We had been planning this hiking trip for a long time. The mountains called to us with their mystery and promise of adventure. There were 5 of us in the group: me, Tom, Sarah, Lisa, and Nate. None of us were experienced hikers, so we decided to hire a local guide. His name was Ethan, a tall man with piercing eyes and a scar on his left cheek. He met us at the base of the mountain early in the morning. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. Ethan led us confidently along the trails, speaking little. The forest around us was thick, and it felt as if the trees were watching us. Tom tried to strike up a conversation with the guide, asking about the local wildlife, but Ethan only gave short, terse answers. His silence made us a bit uneasy, but we chalked it up to his rugged mountain man demeanor. By noon, the sky had darkened with clouds. Ethan suggested we pick up the pace to set up camp before the rain hit. His voice had an edge of urgency to it. Lisa noticed that he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he was expecting something. It was starting to make us all anxious, but we followed him anyway. Soon, the path became less distinct, and Ethan led us through thick underbrush. Sarah stumbled and nearly fell. Nate helped her up, shooting an annoyed look at the guide. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Tom asked. Ethan didn't respond. He just quickened his pace. It felt strange. Tom walked up to me and quietly said, "Something's not right. He's leading us deeper into the forest when we should have turned north by now." I nodded. A sense of unease was building inside me. We stopped for a break, and I decided to confront Ethan directly. "Ethan, we need to know where we're going," I said. He gave me a cold stare. "Forward. It's not safe to stop here." His answer sent a chill down my spine. Just then, a distant howl echoed through the trees. Lisa turned pale. "What was that?" she whispered. Ethan tensed up and said, "We need to move. Now." He spun around and marched ahead. We exchanged uneasy glances. Tom clenched his fists. "I'm not following him blindly anymore," he declared. Sarah agreed. "Let's go back. This is getting too weird." But before we could make a decision, Ethan stopped and turned to face us. His features had changed. His face had become sharper, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. He smiled, baring sharp teeth. "It's too late to turn back," he said in a low, guttural voice. My heart froze. Nate took a step back. "Run!" he yelled. We scattered. The forest became a maze, with every tree looking the same. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of pursuit. Heavy, rapid footsteps and the snapping of branches. I ran, barely aware of where I was going, just trying to escape. Suddenly, a cliff appeared in front of me. I stopped just in time, pebbles tumbling down into the abyss. Behind me, a growl echoed. I turned and saw what had once been Ethan. He was now a massive wolf standing on hind legs, eyes glowing and fangs bared. There was nowhere to go. I spotted a narrow path along the edge of the cliff and dashed onto it. The ground was slippery under my feet, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The creature was still chasing me, the gap between us closing quickly. Out of nowhere, Tom appeared from a side trail. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into a hidden crevice between the rocks. "Quiet," he whispered. We held our breath. The werewolf raced past us, unaware of our hiding spot. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. "Where are the others?" I asked. "I don't know," Tom replied. "We need to find them and get out of here." We crept through the forest, staying in the shadows. The woods seemed endless. All around us were strange noises, rustling, moaning, sounds that chilled us to the bone. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin. There were no lights inside, but it was our only hope. We quietly approached and entered. The cabin was empty, but old hunting rifles hung on the walls. "Maybe we can use these," Tom suggested, taking one down. I nodded. Just then, the door creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway. She looked terrified, but uninjured. "You're alive!" she exclaimed, rushing toward us. We barricaded the door and tried to come up with a plan. Sarah told us she had seen Nate and Lisa running in a different direction. We decided to wait until morning and then try to find them. The night was horrifying. Outside the cabin, we heard sounds that sent chills down our spines. It felt like the creatures were circling us, waiting for the right moment. At one point, there was a knock at the window. Slowly, I turned my head and saw Lisa's face. She was staring at us with empty eyes before disappearing into the darkness. "It's a trap," Tom whispered. By morning, we cautiously stepped out of the cabin. The forest was quiet, as if nothing had happened, but we knew the danger wasn't over. Deciding not to search for the others, we made our way back to the base of the mountain. After hours of hiking, we finally made it out. We went to the police, but they didn't believe us. The search teams found no trace of our friends or the strange creatures. Months have passed since then. Tom moved to another city, trying to forget what happened. But I can't escape the nightmares. Story 3. Below is a letter from a journalist, sent to the editorial office just hours before his disappearance. I understand that what you are about to read may seem unbelievable, but I urge you to publish this material. People need to know the truth about what is happening in this place. I was sent to a small town called Silverton to investigate a series of mysterious disappearances. The town is isolated, surrounded by dense forests, far from major roads. Upon arrival, I immediately noticed an unusual tension in the air. The residents eyed me with suspicion, many turning away when I tried to speak to them. On the first day, I managed to speak with the owner of a local cafe. He reluctantly told me that people had been disappearing here for years, but no one paid attention to it. "It's better to mind your own business," he said as a parting warning. I decided to walk around town and take some photographs. The streets were mostly empty, and those who were out hurried past me. I managed to capture images of an old church, an abandoned school, and several houses with boarded-up windows. That evening, back at the town's only hotel, I found a note slipped under my door. "Leave while you still can." It alarmed me, but it also piqued my curiosity. Clearly, someone didn't want me digging into local matters. The next day, I visited the town archive. In old newspapers and records, I discovered that these disappearances had been happening regularly for over 50 years. But the strangest thing was that no investigations were ever conducted. It was as if everyone simply accepted it as a fact of life. When I returned to my hotel room, I found my belongings had been rifled through. Nothing was missing, but it was clear someone was watching me. I decided not to stay in the room and went out to continue my investigation. On one of the side streets, I noticed a woman watching me from a window. When our eyes met, she motioned for me to come in. This was my chance to get information. Her home was dark and cool. She introduced herself as Margaret. In a quiet voice, she told me that the town was shrouded in an ancient secret. "They don't like outsiders," she said. When I asked who they were, she just shook her head and added, "You must leave while you still can." Thanking her, I left. Dusk was falling, and the town seemed deserted. I decided to return to the hotel and quicken my pace. But along the way, I noticed that I was being followed. Shadows flickered in shop windows, and figures appeared at the corners of buildings. When I reached the hotel, I found the door locked. I banged on it, called out, no response. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw a group of people slowly approaching. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but there was something malevolent in their eyes. Without thinking, I ran. I turned one corner, then another, trying to lose my pursuers. Soon, I found myself on the outskirts of town, near the edge of the forest. It seemed like I had shaken them off. The forest was dark, but I had no choice. I plunged into the trees, hoping to hide. But it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. I heard rustling, the snapping of branches. My heart raced, my breath coming in short gasps. Suddenly, a shadow moved ahead of me. I stopped. From behind the trees emerged a figure. Its proportions were off. Its arms were too long, and its movements were fluid and predatory. It stared at me, its eyes glowing with a dim yellow light. I turned to run back, but more of these creatures blocked my way. They were slowly closing in, forming a circle around me. Fear gripped me so tightly that I couldn't speak. Then they began to change. Their bodies shifted, faces elongated, covered in fur, sharp fangs and claws emerging. These were werewolves. I couldn't believe my eyes, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. In a desperate last moment, I remembered my camera. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and started taking pictures. The flashes momentarily blinded the creatures, causing them to retreat, growling and squinting. This brief pause gave me a chance. I darted between them, miraculously slipping through, and ran. I didn't look back, racing through the forest, stumbling and falling, but each time I got up and kept running. Finally, I emerged into an open area and spotted an old, abandoned shed. I rushed inside, barricading the door with whatever I could find. It was dark and damp inside, but at least it was safe for now. I checked my camera. The photos were blurry, but in some of them, you could make out the silhouettes of the creatures. I had to get this evidence out. I pulled out my laptop and mobile modem, desperately trying to connect to the internet. The signal was weak, but I managed to send the email with the photos and an account of everything that had happened. By the time you're reading this, I might already be dead. I can hear them getting closer. The footsteps outside are growing louder, the sound of claws scraping against the wood. I don't have much time. Please publish this information. People need to know the danger that hides in this town. No one should come here. If I make it out, I will contact you. But if I don't, remember, they don't want their secret revealed. Stay safe." This letter was received by the editorial office, but the journalist was never heard from again. Search teams sent to Silverton found no trace of his presence. The town's residents denied that anyone had visited them in the past few weeks. The photos attached to the letter were blurry and unclear, but some did show strange figures. Despite the lack of solid evidence, the editorial office felt it necessary to publish the story in hopes of warning others. Story 4. This diary was found in the mountains and belonged to the genetic scientist Andrew Holden. I must confess, for many years, I've worked as a geneticist in a private research lab on the outskirts of the city. My field of expertise is studying rare and little-known genetic sequences. In recent years, I've dedicated myself to projects focused on finding new treatments for hereditary diseases. One morning, when I arrived at the lab, I found a sealed container on my desk marked urgent. Inside was a DNA sample, discovered by a group of biologists in a remote forest area. A note from my colleague, Dr. Martin, accompanied it. "Andrew, take a look at this. Very strange structure. I need your opinion." I immediately got to work. Initial analysis showed that the DNA structure contained unknown sequences that didn't match any known organism. This piqued my professional interest. I decided to conduct a more detailed study to understand the nature of the sample. Throughout the day, I focused on decoding the genome, gradually becoming more immersed in the task. The more I studied it, the more mysteries it presented. Some genes bore a resemblance to human DNA, but there were mutations that shouldn't have occurred in nature. I searched through the literature, but found nothing like it. That evening, Dr. Martin stopped by. "Any updates?" he asked. "This is incredible," I replied. "The structure is unique. It feels like a hybrid of something human and something unknown." "Do you think it could be a breakthrough?" he asked, intrigued. "Possibly. More tests are needed." He nodded and wished me luck, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Late that night, after everyone had left, I decided to conduct an experiment at the cellular level. I prepared a culture of human cells and added a small amount of serum synthesized from the sample. The results were astonishing. The cells began to divide rapidly, showing signs of accelerated regeneration. I watched the process with a mixture of awe and unease. The next day, I continued the experiments, documenting every step. I chose not to inform my colleagues about the findings yet, to avoid jumping to premature conclusions. Deep down, I felt I was on the verge of a major discovery. But that evening, an incident occurred. While working, I accidentally cut my finger on a broken glass vial. A small drop of the serum made contact with the wound. I quickly washed the cut and applied antiseptic, thinking little of it, though I noted the incident in my journal. By nightfall, I started feeling fatigued and slightly unwell. I decided to head home and rest. At home, my temperature spiked and a headache set in. I thought it was just a cold and went to bed early. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Looking in the mirror, I noticed my eyes had brightened and my pupils were dilated. My heart was racing. I took some fever-reducing medicine and tried to sleep again. By morning, My condition had improved. My temperature was normal, and the headache was gone. But I felt an unusual surge of energy. It was as if all my senses had sharpened. I could hear distant sounds from the street, and I could pick up scents I had never noticed before. At the lab, I decided to run a blood test on myself, just to make sure everything was fine. The results made me uneasy. There were unknown cells in my blood, exhibiting high activity. This was impossible, but the facts were staring me in the face. I tried to contact Dr. Martin, but he was at a conference. Not wanting to alarm my other colleagues, I decided to continue monitoring myself in secret. Throughout the day, my heightened senses began to overwhelm me. Sounds became too loud, and smells were overwhelming. That evening, as I walked home, I realized the twilight was more comfortable for me than daylight. I could see in the dark much better than I should have been able to. It terrified me and raised even more questions. At home, I began writing down every change in my diary, hoping to find some explanation. I reread my notes on the serum and realized that the accidental exposure to it might have triggered these effects. But how far could these changes go? That night, I couldn't sleep again. My body ached, and my muscles cramped. At some point, the pain became unbearable, and I blacked out. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself lying on the living room floor. My clothes were torn, and the room was in disarray. Objects were scattered, furniture overturned. I had no memory of what had happened. My heart pounded with dread. What if I had done something terrible? I rushed to check my phone and the news. There were no reports of any incidents. That gave me some relief, but the questions remained. I wasted no time and returned to the lab to run more tests. The results showed that the mutation was progressing. My DNA had changed further, integrating the unknown sequences. I understood this was dangerous, but I didn't know how to stop it. I avoided contact with my colleagues throughout the day. Every sharp sound or bright light irritated me. My head buzzed, and my focus slipped. I isolated myself in a separate room in the lab to continue my research alone. As evening approached, I felt another wave of changes coming. My pulse quickened, and my breathing grew labored. I recorded my sensations, hoping this would help find a solution. At some point, the door opened, and Dr. Martin walked in. "Andrew, are you okay?" he asked, noticing my state. "No," I admitted. "We need to talk." I told him everything, about the serum, the experiments, and the changes in me. He listened carefully without interrupting. "This is very serious," he said after a pause. "We need to inform the administration and seek help immediately." "No," I shot back sharply. "If they find out, they'll isolate me or worse. I can't trust them." "But you can't handle this alone," Martin insisted. "We need to find a way to stop the mutation." I knew he was right. We agreed to work together to create an antidote, something that could reverse the process. The next hours were spent in intense work. Time was slipping away, and the results were discouraging. The mutation was progressing faster than we could have anticipated. I felt like I was losing control of myself. "We need more time," Martin said, reviewing the data. "We don't have it," I replied, my voice growing hoarse. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through me. I grabbed my head, struggling against the surge. Martin stepped back, fear filling his eyes. "Andrew, what's happening to you?" "Lock me up," I managed to say through gritted teeth. He rushed to the control panel and activated the lockdown system. The lab's walls began to close in, sealing me inside a containment unit. The last thing I remember was Martin's face, twisted with worry, as the light faded from my sight. I woke up to silence. Chaos surrounded me. Glass shattered, equipment destroyed. I was lying on the cold floor, my body covered in scrapes. My head throbbed, but my mind was starting to clear. "Martin!" I shouted, getting to my feet. There was no answer. I searched the lab and found him in the corridor. He was unconscious, but alive. Relief quickly gave way to guilt. I realized I was becoming a danger to those around me. A decision had to be made. Gathering all the records and research data, I placed them in a secure container and left a note. This may help understand and perhaps stop the process. I'm sorry. Leaving the lab, I headed home. I packed my essentials and left the city. I chose to go to the mountains where I could isolate myself from people. Several days have passed. I've set up a temporary shelter in an abandoned cabin. I survive on whatever I find in the forest. I keep writing in this diary, documenting every change. The nights are the hardest. I tie myself up to prevent harm, but it doesn't always work. One evening, after waking from another episode, I found a pack of wolves nearby. They watched me without aggression, almost as if they accepted me. It was terrifying and, at the same time, gave me a strange sense of belonging. I understood that the process was irreversible. All that was left was to accept it and try to live in harmony with this new state. I write these final lines in the hope that someone will find my diary and learn the truth. My story is a warning. Don't meddle with forces we don't understand. The whereabouts of Andrew Holden remain unknown. The lab where he worked was shut down, and the research was classified. No official comments followed. Story 5. As a civil engineer, I was used to surprises on the job. But what we found beneath the old city building surpassed all expectations. Our team was renovating a structure in the city center when we stumbled upon an unknown underground passage. Descending into it, we discovered an ancient stone-laid tunnel. The air was damp and cold, smelling of earth and mold. I took 2 colleagues with me, Evan and Luke. We grabbed our flashlights and set off to explore. "Look at these old bricks," Evan remarked, running his hand along the wall. These tunnels could be several hundred years old. We moved forward, lighting our way. The tunnel gradually widened into a network of corridors. Strange symbols and drawings appeared on the walls. I took a few photos with my phone for the report. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Luke said quietly. "Maybe we should turn back." "A little further," I replied. "We need to figure out where these corridors lead." Things only got more interesting. We stumbled upon a large hall with a high ceiling. In the center stood a stone altar surrounded by weathered inscriptions. Symbols resembling ancient runes were laid out on the floor. "Wow," Evan breathed. "This looks like some kind of ritual site." A chill ran down my spine. The atmosphere was oppressive. Deciding not to linger, we turned back. But when we returned to the corridor, we realized we didn't recognize the way. "This isn't the right passage," Luke said. I don't remember these drawings. Maybe we took a wrong turn. I tried to reassure him. Let's try another corridor. We continued on, but the tunnel seemed endless. Each time we ended up in the same place or found ourselves in new chambers we hadn't seen before. Panic began to rise. This is impossible, Evan said nervously. We were walking in a straight line. Suddenly, our flashlights began to flicker. The light grew weaker and weaker. The batteries couldn't be dying this fast. The darkness around us thickened. We need to stay calm, I said, though I was barely keeping my own fear in check. From the depths of the tunnel, a faint noise echoed, a rustling sound. We froze. The sound came again, this time closer. Who's there? Luke shouted, but there was only silence in response. Deciding not to wait around, we pressed on, trying to find an exit. But the tunnels seemed to be toying with us, changing places. I felt the walls closing in, pressing down on us. Suddenly, Evan cried out and fell. We rushed to him. He pointed to his leg. A hidden trap had clamped onto his foot in the shadows. Freeing him, we realized time was running out. We need to find a way out, or we'll be stuck here forever, I said, helping Evan to his feet. The rustling sounds around us grew louder. It felt as though something was watching us. The flashlights were almost dead, leaving us in near darkness. Suddenly, a shadow flickered ahead. I strained my eyes to see. From the darkness, two glowing eyes stared back at us. A creature, humanoid but with long limbs and fur, slowly approached. The creature stopped a few meters away from us. We stood frozen, unable to move. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. "Run!" Luke whispered, grabbing my arm. We bolted in the opposite direction, supporting Evan as he limped. The tunnels twisted, but we had no choice. Behind us, we heard quick steps and heavy breathing. Soon, we reached a dead end. A wall blocked our way. There was no exit. The creature was closing in, its silhouette visible in the faint light. Despair engulfed us. Then I noticed a narrow gap in the wall, hidden behind some stones. "Over here!" I shouted. We squeezed through, crawling up the narrow passage. It led upward, as if toward the surface. The crawl space was tight, but the hope of escape gave us strength. As we crawled forward, we heard the creature breaking the stones behind us, trying to reach us. Dirt crumbled around us. The air grew heavy. Finally, a faint light appeared ahead. We emerged outside through an old well in an abandoned park. Night had fallen over the city, but the fresh air felt like salvation. Evan collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. "We made it," Luke whispered. But our relief was short-lived. Out of the shadows of the trees, several figures appeared. They looked just like the creature in the tunnel. We realized the danger wasn't over. "What do they want?" Evan asked desperately. I looked around for an escape. Not far away, the lights of residential houses flickered. "Run there. Maybe we'll be safe." Gathering the last of our strength, we sprinted toward the houses. The figures pursued us, but didn't come too close, as if they were waiting for something. We reached the nearest house and pounded on the door. No one answered. The figures stopped at the edge of the light, not stepping into the illuminated area. At that moment, the door opened, and an elderly man appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing our terrified faces. "Please, let us in," Luke pleaded. The man glanced at the shadows, noticing the figures, and quickly ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked quietly. We nodded, still unable to believe that someone understood what we were talking about. They've been here for a long time. The city was built on their land, and they don't like it when people disturb their rest. "Who are they?" I finally managed to ask. "The ancient guardians. Some call them werewolves, but that's only part of the truth." We spent the rest of the night in the old man's house, listening to his stories about legends and curses. He warned us that we should leave the city and never return. In the morning, we thanked him and hurried away. Evan needed medical attention, so we headed to the hospital. As we walked through the city, everything looked normal. People going about their business as if nothing had happened. At the hospital, we tried to tell the doctors what had happened, but they didn't believe us. They chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. No one wanted to hear about underground tunnels or mysterious creatures. A few days later, Evan disappeared from the hospital. No one knew where he had gone. Luke and I began to fear for our lives. Not wanting to take any more risks, we left the city, moving to a different place. Story 6. The morning was cold and damp. The man gathered his gear and headed into the woods. He was an experienced hunter, familiar with this land as well as the back of his hand. Today, his target was rare game he had been tracking for several weeks. The forest greeted him with silence. No birds sang, and there wasn't even a rustle of leaves. It struck him as strange, but he didn't dwell on it. The weather could easily alter animal behavior. As he ventured deeper, he spotted tracks on the ground. They were large, resembling wolf prints, but much bigger than any he had seen before. His interest piqued. Perhaps he had come across the trail of an unusually large wolf, or even a bear. Cautiously, he followed the tracks, his rifle at the ready. The further he went, the more he felt like something was watching him. He glanced around, but saw nothing. A shadow flickered between the trees, but when he looked closer, there was nothing there. Dusk came sooner than he expected. The man decided to stop and make camp. He gathered some dry branches, but his matches were soaked, and the fire refused to catch. The darkness thickened around him, and a fog began to rise from the ground. Then in the distance, a howl echoed. It was deep and drawn out, unlike any wolf howl he had ever heard. His heart raced, but he tried to calm himself. Maybe it was just the wind or an echo. The howl came again, closer this time. Deciding to abandon his camp, he turned to head back to his truck. But the trail had disappeared. The forest felt unfamiliar. The trees seemed to close in, blocking his way. Footsteps behind him made him whirl around. No one was there. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He quickened his pace, fighting the rising panic. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him. The creature stood on two legs, but its form was far from human. It was enormous, covered in thick fur, with a wolf's head and glowing eyes. It stared at him, motionless. The man raised his rifle and fired. The gunshot rang through the forest, but the creature didn't flinch. The bullet seemed to have no effect. It let out a low growl and began to move toward him. Frantically, he tried to reload his rifle, but his hands were shaking. The bullet slipped from his pocket, scattering on the ground. Realizing the weapon was useless, he turned and ran. The forest became a labyrinth. Branches tore at his clothes. Roots tripped his feet. Behind him, he could hear heavy footsteps and the creature's growl. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his strength was failing. He burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. A cliff dropped off before him. There was no way back. The creature emerged from the shadows, closing in. Desperate, he scanned for an escape. To the right, he spotted a narrow path along the edge of the cliff. Without hesitation, he dashed toward it. The path was treacherous, but he had no other choice. The creature continued to pursue him, its steps confident and swift. The man felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Losing his balance, he tumbled down the slope. When he awoke at the bottom, his body ached all over. Darkness surrounded him. The sounds of movement crept closer. He tried to stand, but his leg was broken. Despair washed over him. The creature emerged from the shadows and stood before him. It tilted its head, as if studying its prey. The man closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But instead of a fatal blow, he felt cold breath on his face. He opened his eyes to find the creature still standing there, unmoving. There was something in its gaze, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even regret. Unable to move, the man watched. Suddenly, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness. He was left alone, stunned by what had just happened. Minutes or hours passed. He couldn't tell. The cold seeped into his bones. Realizing help wouldn't come, he summoned the last of his strength and began to crawl in the direction he thought the road might be. The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest terrified him, but the creature did not return. At dawn, he spotted a break in the trees. It gave him the strength to keep going. He collapsed when he finally reached the road. A passing car stopped, and the driver rushed to help, seeing the exhausted man. He was taken to the hospital. The doctors were astonished by his condition. Multiple fractures, frostbite, but he had survived. When asked what had happened, he couldn't give a coherent answer. After being discharged, the man tried to return to normal life, but the nightmares wouldn't let go. He always felt like something was watching him. In the shadows of the trees, he would catch glimpses of a familiar silhouette. One night, he heard a howl near his house. Stepping outside, he found nothing, but the tracks in the ground were fresh. It confirmed his worst fear. The creature had found him. Realizing the danger was real, he tried to warn others. He went to the authorities, but they dismissed his words as the ravings of a madman. No one believed his story about a werewolf. So, he began gathering information on his own. He discovered that people had been disappearing in those woods for years. Legends and rumors about a mysterious beast circulated among the locals, but no one took them seriously. Determined, he decided to return to the forest to find proof. Armed with cameras and equipment, he set out. Deep down, he knew this might be his last journey. The forest was just as it had been before. The silence, the heavy air, the sense of being watched. He set up cameras in various places, hoping to capture the creature. That night, as he sat by his fire, he heard the familiar howl again. But this time, fear was replaced with resolve. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the sound. The creature appeared in front of him, just like before. But this time, the man felt no panic. He stared straight at it, his camera ready. Suddenly, the beast lunged. The man managed to snap a few photos before the impact sent him flying. Pain shot through his body, and his vision began to fade. The last thing he saw were the creature's eyes, gazing at him with an expression he couldn't understand. Perhaps it was a warning, or a farewell. His body was found several days later. The cause of death was unclear. The camera contained photos, but they were blurry and indistinct. Story 7. Mike and I decided to spend the weekend far from the city. We found a cozy cabin by a lake, surrounded by forest. The place was perfect, peaceful, immersed in nature, and no one around. The moment we arrived, I felt the tension of the past few months begin to lift. Mike smiled at me. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, unloading the car. The cabin was small but cozy. Wooden walls, a fireplace, and a large balcony overlooking the lake. The interior was simple but tasteful. We quickly unpacked and decided to take a walk before sunset. The forest around us was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting a play of light and shadow. Mike took my hand, and we strolled down a narrow path, enjoying the moment. "Look," he pointed to the ground. "Those look like animal tracks." I looked closer. The prints were large, resembling those of a wolf, but much bigger. A slight unease crept over me. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. "Don't worry, there aren't any dangerous animals around here," Mike reassured me. "Besides, we'll be back at the cabin soon." As the sun began to set, we returned. Mike lit a fire in the fireplace, and we settled on the couch with mugs of hot tea. Our conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and memories of funny moments from the past. Night fell quickly. The moon rose, casting a silvery glow over the lake. I stepped out onto the balcony to take in the view. The air was fresh, but there was an unsettling tension in it. "Amazing, isn't it?" Mike wrapped his arms around me from behind. I nodded, though an inexplicable sense of unease gnawed at me. It felt as if the forest was watching us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, listening intently. In the distance, a soft sound, like a howl, echoed. Mike chuckled. "Probably just the wind. Don't worry." But the sound came again, this time louder. My heart began to race. "Maybe we should go inside," I suggested. Mike agreed, and we went back inside. He locked the door, noticing my concern. "It's all good," he said. "Let's watch a movie." We picked a comedy, trying to distract ourselves. But the sounds outside grew louder. Now it wasn't just howling, but also rustling, as if something was moving around the cabin. "That's not the wind," I whispered. Mike stood up and went to the window. Peeking through the curtains, he frowned. "I can't see anything. Probably just animals." "Should we check?" He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the door. "Stay here. I'll be quick." "No, I'm going with you." We stepped out onto the porch. Moonlight bathed the surroundings, but the shadows were thick. Mike shined the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. "See, everything's fine," he said with a smile. But just then, A loud crack came from the forest. We both flinched. The flashlight caught a silhouette in the dark. A large figure stood between the trees, staring straight at us. Its eyes glowed in the beam of the flashlight. "What is that?" I whispered, gripping Mike's arm. "I don't know. Maybe a bear." The creature began to move toward us. Its motions were fluid, yet fast. Mike stepped back. "Get inside. Quickly." We dashed into the cabin and slammed the door shut. Mike locked it and pushed a chair against it for extra security. What was that? Panic gripped me. "I'm not sure. We need to call for help." He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. I felt the cold seep into my bones. "What do we do?" Mike scanned the room. "There are knives in the kitchen. If it comes to it, we'll defend ourselves." The noises outside intensified. The creature was already on the porch. The door shook under the weight of a blow. I screamed, pressing myself against the wall. "Hold on," Mike shouted, gripping a knife. The door began to splinter. The wood groaned under the pressure. The creature broke through. In the moonlight, I saw it in full. Enormous, covered in fur, with claws and fangs. It was a werewolf. Mike lunged at it with the knife, but the creature swatted him away with a single swipe of its paw. I screamed as he slammed into the wall and collapsed, unconscious. Terror froze me, but survival instinct kicked in. I bolted for the back door, fumbling with the lock. My hands trembled. The lock stuck. Behind me, I could hear the deep growls and the sounds of destruction. Finally, the door gave way, and I ran outside. Barefoot on the cold ground, I sprinted toward the woods, hoping to disappear among the trees. The moon lit my path, but the shadows seemed alive. The rustling around me told me I wasn't alone. A loud roar echoed behind me. The werewolf was chasing me. I pushed myself harder, but my legs were weakening from fear and exhaustion. I tripped over a root and fell, scraping my knees. I didn't have time to get up. The creature was upon me, its shadow looming over me. I shut my eyes, bracing for the end. But nothing happened. Slowly, I opened my eyes to see the werewolf standing over me, unmoving. There was something human in its eyes, as if it recognized me. "Please, don't hurt me," I whispered. The creature tilted its head as if listening. Then it turned and vanished into the darkness. I lay there, stunned by what had just happened. Gathering the last of my strength, I got up and kept running. Eventually, I reached the road. A passing car stopped when the driver saw me. He looked at me, shocked by my appearance. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Help? The forest. Mike." I could barely form the words. He helped me into the car and drove me to the nearest town. At the hospital, they treated my wounds. The police questioned me, but my answers made no sense to them. "You're talking about a creature?" one officer asked. "Yes, it was. I don't know how to explain. A werewolf." They exchanged glances. Clearly, they didn't believe me. A search party was sent to look for Mike. A few days passed. They didn't find him. The cabin was destroyed, but there were no signs of a struggle or blood. They released me, suggesting I see a therapist. Back in the city, I tried to return to normal life, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. One day, while going through old photos, I came across a picture of Mike. His eyes reminded me of the creature's gaze. My heart skipped a beat, Could it have been him? Story 8. My brother James had always been an adventurer. When he didn't return from his latest trip to the mountains, I didn't panic right away. He often stayed out for a few extra days, enjoying the solitude and nature. But after a week without a single message, the worry became unbearable. I decided to go search for him. I gathered the necessary gear and headed to the national park where he had gone. The park was vast, with dense forests and rocky mountains. James loved these places for their untouched wilderness and lack of tourists. At the park entrance, I met a ranger named Thomas. I told him about my missing brother, but he just shook his head. "People sometimes disappear in these mountains," he said. "It's hard to find anyone without a specific route." I insisted, and he reluctantly gave me a map of the area, pointing out some trails James might have taken. As I entered the forest, I immediately felt its strangeness. The silence was absolute. No birds, no animal sounds. Only the crunch of leaves under my boots broke the stillness. It seemed odd, but I chalked it up to my tense state of mind. On the second day of my search, I stumbled upon James's camp. His tent was set up, but there was no one inside. His things were in place, food untouched. It was as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. I searched the area and noticed strange tracks on the ground. They were large, resembling wolf prints, but far bigger than normal. My heart raced. Maybe James had encountered a bear or some other dangerous predator. I grabbed his journal and a flashlight, deciding to continue the search. His journal contained notes about his route and observations. The last entry read, "Heard strange sounds last night. Like a howl, but not quite like a wolf. I'll check it out in the morning." Those words made me uneasy. What could he have heard? That night, I decided to stay at his camp. I built a fire and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The same oppressive silence surrounded me. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard a sound. A deep, long howl that sent chills down my spine. I stood up, listening. The sound came again, this time closer. The fire seemed weak and helpless against the encroaching darkness. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the area but saw nothing. Deciding not to take any chances, I returned to the fire and fed the flames. I sat there the rest of the night, clutching a knife, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I followed the tracks I had seen earlier. They led deeper into the forest, toward the mountains. As I progressed, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The trees here were taller and denser, the light barely filtering through the canopy. Soon, I came across an old hunting cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, it was empty, but on the table lay James's compass and pocket knife. How had they gotten here? I began to search the cabin. Strange symbols and markings were scratched into the walls, their meaning unknown to me. The floor creaked underfoot, and the air was stale. Suddenly, a shadow flickered outside the window. I turned, but saw no one. My heart raced. It could have just been a trick of the light, but the sense of danger was growing. Deciding to leave the cabin, I stepped outside. The forest felt alive. Every tree seemed to be watching me. I continued forward, hoping to find some clue. The day was drawing to a close, and the shadows were growing longer. I realized I needed to find a place to camp for the night. but the thought of spending another night in this forest terrified me. Then I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned and saw a figure between the trees. A person? I shouted, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. The figure disappeared into the shadows. I ran toward where it had been, but found no one, only silence and thick vegetation. Returning to the trail, I felt lost. My compass started acting strangely, the needle spinning wildly. Panic began to take hold. As darkness fell, I found a small cave and decided to take shelter there. I built a small fire and sat against the wall. My mind raced with thoughts of James. What had happened to him? The night was quiet, but there was something unnatural in that silence. Suddenly, I heard the same howl, much closer this time. I gripped the knife and froze. Footsteps echoed from the depths of the cave. Slow, heavy. The fire's light didn't reach far enough to see what was there. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The footsteps grew nearer. A shadow appeared at the edge of the fire's light. It was a person, but something was wrong about them. The figure stepped into the light, and I recognized James, but his eyes were empty, his skin pale, and his movements unnatural. "James!" I cried, standing up. "What happened to you?" He didn't respond. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond me. I stepped closer, but he retreated into the shadows. "Brother, it's me. What's going on?" Suddenly, his body began to change. Bones cracked, muscles tensed. He let out a low growl, and I realized he was no longer human. A werewolf now stood where my brother had been. A massive creature with glowing eyes and sharp fangs. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature slowly advanced. I backed away, but the cave wall stopped me. Realizing I had nowhere to run, I raised the knife. "James, please, stop." The werewolf paused for a moment, as if recognizing me. Something human flickered in its eyes, but then it roared and lunged forward. I dodged, feeling its claws graze my shoulder. Pain shot through my body and blood flowed down my arm. Adrenaline surged. I slashed with the knife, but the blade barely scratched its fur. Summoning all my strength, I slipped past it and dashed for the cave entrance. The night was dark, but the moonlight illuminated my path. I ran without looking back, hearing heavy footsteps behind me. The forest turned into a maze. Branches whipped my face, and roots tripped my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, but fear drove me forward. Suddenly, headlights appeared ahead. It was the road. Gathering the last of my strength, I stumbled onto the asphalt. A car screeched to a stop. "What's going on?" the driver yelled, jumping out. "Help, please just drive," I gasped. He didn't ask questions. I climbed into the car, and we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the silhouette of the werewolf standing at the edge of the road. Weeks have passed. I've tried to come to terms with losing my brother and what happened. I haven't been able to return to the forest. Fear holds me back. The fear that I might become like him. A creature with no will, driven only by the instinct to kill. And the fear that I might die at the hands of my own brother. Story 9. I've been a truck driver for many years. Long night drives on empty highways have become routine for me. That night, I was set to cover a stretch of Route 66, known for its abandoned areas and rare gas stations. The weather was clear, and the moon illuminated the road, casting ghostly shadows. The radio had lost its signal, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. After driving for several hours without stopping, I decided to take a break and check on the truck. I pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was unusual. No cars, no sounds of nature. Only the gentle rustle of bushes in the wind. I checked the tires and decided to stretch my legs. Suddenly, I saw the faint glow of a flashlight in the distance. Someone was walking along the roadside toward me. It was strange, given how remote the area was. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a middle-aged man, dressed in worn-out clothes. "Hey," he said quietly, "could you give me a ride to the nearest town?" I hesitated. On the one hand, I didn't want to leave someone stranded on the road. On the other, there was something unsettling about his appearance. "The nearest town is 100 miles away," I replied. "What are you doing out here at this time of night?" He shrugged. "Long story. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd be really grateful if you could help me out." I sighed and decided to let him in. "All right, hop in." He climbed into the cab, and we continued down the road. We drove in silence for a while. I tried to make small talk, but he only gave one-word answers. His gaze was fixed ahead, and it seemed like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. After about an hour, I noticed that the fuel was running low. I needed to find a gas station, but they were few and far between in this area. "Do you know if there's a gas station nearby?" I asked. "There's one not far from here," he said unexpectedly. "Turn at the next junction." I was surprised since my maps showed nothing in that direction. But I didn't have much of a choice. I followed his directions. The road veered off, and soon we pulled up to an old gas station. It looked abandoned, but the lights inside were on. "That's odd," I said. "I've driven this road before and never noticed this place." "Not many people stop here," the passenger replied. I got out of the truck and headed toward the building. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Behind the counter stood an elderly man. "How can I help you?" he asked with a smile. "I need to fill up," I replied. "Is the pump working?" "Of course," he nodded. "Fill up first, then come in and pay." I returned to the truck and started pumping gas. The passenger stayed in the cab, staring straight ahead. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Once the tank was full, I went back inside. The old man was still standing there, smiling the same unsettling smile. "That'll be $20, he said. I handed him the money and decided to ask, "How long have you been here?" "I drive this road often, but I've never seen this station." "Oh, we've been here a long time," he replied. "It's just that not everyone notices us." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Right. Thanks," I said, heading for the door. When I got back to the truck, the passenger was gone. He had vanished without a trace. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. "Hey, where are you?" I called out, but the only response was silence. Deciding not to waste any more time, I climbed into the cab and drove off. But thoughts of the strange passenger and the gas station wouldn't leave my mind. A few miles down the road, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. Someone was driving behind me, slowly getting closer. Suddenly, the engine began to sputter. The truck jerked, and my speed dropped. I tried to pull over, but the brakes weren't responding. Panic started to set in. The road ahead sloped downward, and I couldn't control the truck. At the last moment, I managed to steer it onto a patch of dirt. The truck came to a sudden, jarring stop. My breathing was ragged, and my heart was pounding. I tried restarting the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Darkness surrounded me. The headlights from the car behind me had disappeared. Silence filled the air once again. I stepped out of the cab to check the truck. There were no visible signs of damage. What could have caused it to fail? Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the same passenger standing there. He was still, his eyes cold and emotionless. "What's going on?" I asked. "You weren't supposed to come here," he said quietly. "What do you mean? This is a public road." He took a step forward. "This place isn't for people." I felt a rising sense of dread in his words. "Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. I need to call for help." "No one's coming," he said. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The situation was getting worse by the second. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. At that moment, his face began to change. His features distorted, and his eyes glowed with a yellow light. He transformed into a creature that resembled a wolf standing on two legs. Fear gripped me. I backed away but tripped and fell. The creature advanced, its claws gleaming in the moonlight. Summoning all my strength, I got to my feet and sprinted toward the trees. Branches whipped my face, and roots snagged at my feet, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Behind me, I could hear the growling and heavy footsteps. I knew there was little chance of escape, but I couldn't stop running. Suddenly, a light appeared ahead. It was a small cabin. I rushed inside and slammed the door shut. I barricaded it with furniture and crouched down, trying to stay calm. Outside, the creature circled the cabin, scratching at the walls, but it couldn't get in. The inside of the cabin was dark. I found a candle and lit it. On the table were old books and notes. They spoke of ancient creatures that hunted travelers in these parts. I realized I had walked into a trap. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The creature didn't leave. I searched for an escape, but there were no windows, and the back door was nailed shut. At dawn, the noises stopped. I cautiously peeked outside. Nothing. Wasting no time, I ran back to the road. The truck was still there. I couldn't get it to start, but I noticed my phone had a signal again. I called for help and waited by the roadside, constantly looking over my shoulder. The rescue team arrived hours later. I told them what had happened, but they were skeptical. They towed my truck back to town. I decided to take a break from driving and try to make sense of what had happened. Later I learned that many people had gone missing along that stretch of road. The locals avoided the area and spoke of it reluctantly. Story 10. I was a photographer specializing in abandoned places. I'd always been drawn to the stories behind forgotten buildings, their mysteries and hidden beauty. One day, I came across information online about an old hotel located deep in a remote area, far from towns and roads. It was said to have been built in the early 20th century, but was closed down after a series of mysterious events. I decided it was the perfect subject for my next photo series. I packed my gear and set out. The drive was long, taking me through forests and over hills. My GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on a map and the few signs that appeared along the way, becoming scarcer as I went. By evening, I finally saw the hotel. It was a large Victorian-style building, both majestic and eerie. The facade was peeling, the windows shattered, but the structure remained intact. Tall trees surrounded it, shielding it from prying eyes. I parked the car and approached the entrance. The large wooden doors were slightly ajar. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the dusty floor. The lobby was spacious, with high ceilings and an old chandelier hanging at a strange angle. Taking out my camera, I began photographing. Light streamed through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows. It felt like I'd stepped into another time, cut off from the modern world. Climbing to the second floor, I found a long corridor lined with doors. I decided to peek into a few rooms. They were empty, save for scraps of wallpaper and broken furniture, remnants of a bygone era. In one room, I found an old diary on a nightstand. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the diary and began reading. The entries belonged to a young woman named Emily, who had worked as a maid at the hotel. She described strange events, guests disappearing, odd noises at night, and sightings of ghostly figures. The last entry sent a chill through me. Today, I heard footsteps in the empty hallway again. No one believes me. I'm scared. If anything happens, I hope someone finds out the truth. Feeling uneasy, I decided not to linger. But before leaving, I wanted to take a few more shots in the basement, rumored to be the most mysterious part of the hotel. Descending into the basement, I was hit by a rush of cold air. The hallways were narrow, the walls damp. My flashlight illuminated old pipes, rusted doors, and cobwebs in the corners. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned but saw nothing. Figuring it was just rats, I kept going. But then the rustling came again, closer this time. My heart began to race. I quickened my pace, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The darkness thickened, and my flashlight started to flicker. Then ahead of me, a silhouette appeared. A person standing still. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound confident. There was no response. The figure began moving toward me, slowly. I stepped back, but tripped and fell. When I looked up, the figure was gone. Panic set in. I turned and ran, trying to find my way out. But the hallways had changed. It felt like I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavy. Then I heard a faint whisper. The words were unintelligible, but the voice sounded like it was right next to me. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound. At last, I found the stairs leading back up. As I burst out of the basement, relief washed over me. But my relief was short-lived. In the lobby stood the figure again, now fully visible. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale, her eyes empty. She stared at me without blinking. I froze, unable to move. Fear gripped my entire body. "What do you want?" I whispered. She raised her hand and pointed toward the door. Taking the hint, I decided not to test my luck and headed for the exit. But just as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a loud bang. I turned around, and the woman had disappeared. There was no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched remained. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Please, let me out!" I yelled into the empty space. In response, I heard laughter, cold and lifeless. Footsteps echoed from upstairs, growing louder, reverberating through the building. I rushed to the nearest window, trying to break the glass, but it wouldn't shatter. The footsteps were getting closer. I spotted an open door to one of the rooms and darted inside, locking it behind me. The room was furnished with antique furniture that looked as if it were new. A candle burned on the table, though I hadn't seen it lit before. It seemed impossible. A mirror hung on the wall. In its reflection, I didn't see myself. I saw the woman. She stood behind me. Spinning around, I found no one there. But in the mirror, she continued to watch me. "Who are you?" I whispered, realizing I was losing my grip on reality. Suddenly, the room began to change. The walls trembled, the furniture vanished. I found myself in a void, surrounded by darkness. A voice echoed around me. "You shouldn't have come here. This place is not for the living." I felt the cold seep into my body, draining my strength. Desperate, I remembered the diary. Maybe it held some answers. Frantically, I flipped through the pages. On the last few, there was a map of the building with an exit marked. It gave me hope. Focusing on the map, I imagined the path out. Slowly, the walls reappeared, and the room returned to its original state. I bolted down the hallway and up the stairs, following the map. Footsteps and voices trailed me, but I didn't look back. Finally, I reached the attic. According to the map, there was a hidden exit to the roof. Sure enough, I found a hatch in the corner and climbed up the ladder. The wind howled as I stepped onto the roof. From there, I could see the forest and the road in the distance. But how would I get down? It was a long drop. At that moment, the door to the roof flew open and the woman emerged. But now, her face had twisted with rage. Her eyes burned with hatred. Knowing I had no choice, I moved to the edge. Below, there was an awning and some bushes. My chances of survival weren't great, but it was better than staying here. Taking a deep breath, I jumped. The impact was hard, but the bushes softened the fall. Pain shot through my leg, but I could still move. Limping, I ran toward my car. Glancing back, I saw no one on the roof. But I knew I had to leave immediately. I started the engine and sped off. The hotel faded into the mist as its silhouette disappeared behind me,